Morning. Hope everyone is doing well this morning. It's great to see all your faces this morning and to worship together in song and prayer as we have and gather around the Lord's table to remember His death. It's a new month, so I want to remind you of a new schedule. Every September we switch over to our open home meeting schedule, which means that we begin open home meetings on the second Sunday of this month. I believe that's September the 10th, and I'm very excited about the study for this series. It's going to be the personality of the Savior. So we're going to talk about Jesus and His personality, both to inspire us to follow Him and also to show us an example of how we ought to be. There's a lot in His character to emulate, of course. That's what we'll be talking about in our open home meetings on the second and fourth Sundays of every month, and be looking in this week's update for your new groups. And if you are confused about anything, see me or one of the elders, and we'll be glad to help you out. That also means that tonight we won't be coming back at 5 o'clock for services, so just remember we are switching in September to our open home meeting schedule. I appreciate what Jim said about our youth. We are focusing on youth this month as we think about fitting together, and the youth of the congregation ensure that we will continue to fit together. And the reason we picked September as the month to think and focus on the young people is because our Deep Youth Conference is coming up September 22nd through the 24th. We have more registered to come than we've ever had before. Nearly 300 have already registered for this event. And there's some debate about how many people this auditorium will hold. I'm thinking it's about 300, so we ought to have a house full. Sunday of that weekend, we will definitely be bringing chairs in, and we will be at capacity, which means the singing will be beautiful. I'm really looking forward to that weekend. I hope you are too. So thanks to all who are working so hard to make that a reality. I want to start a new series this morning, and the series is True Crime, Stories of Sin in the Bible. Every Sunday for a while, we'll be talking about a different story of sin in the Bible. And we're labeling it true crime. It's a really popular genre, especially in podcasts. I don't know if you listen to podcasts, but the true crime genre is by far the most popular of all the podcasts there are. I think 34% of people say their favorite type of podcast to listen to is true crime. That really makes you scratch your head. You wonder, what is it that draws people so much to true crime podcasts? Why do they want to hear these stories about murder and rape and serial killings? And why are we so fascinated with those things? And there are a number of reasons if you think about it. One, of course, we have to say, is we can't look away from the spectacle. It's like rubbernecking on the highway. You know, there's something shocking. There's that forbidden fascination, there's that adrenaline rush, and we just have to look. That's part of it, but it's deeper than that. Another thing is, true crime, at least the good true crime, has the elements of a good story. And human beings are drawn into good stories, especially those that relate the human condition. And so all of these start out with the crime, the tragedy, which resonates with us. Because if you live long enough, you get familiar with sorrow and tragedy and loss. And so that's the hook. And then you have the puzzle, the mystery, the mental challenge, which we all enjoy. But in this particular puzzle, the stakes are as high as they can get, life or death, right? And then at the end of most of these stories, the criminal is caught, the mystery is solved, and you get a sense of relief and satisfaction that you get with closure, a resolution in a good story. So there's that. And then also hearing stories about the worst people among us focuses us on our blessings. On one side of that, you think, well, I'm glad this hasn't happened to me. You know, you focus on the victim and you say, well, things have been bad, but not that bad. And then you focus on the criminal and you say, well, I'm bad, I have my flaws, but I'm not that bad. So you kind of focus on the worst of humanity and makes you look at what's good in your life. But more than all of these things, if you read about this and you try to understand America's fascination with true crime, what you find is a lot of us listen to this because we're trying to figure out how to be safe. We listen to it to try to learn how to protect ourselves. We're either doing that consciously or maybe on a subconscious level. What's really interesting is the majority of people who listen to these true crime podcasts are women. Women double the number of men who listen to these podcasts. It's very popular with women, and maybe it's because women don't feel safe in society, and they're trying to listen to how others get hurt and avoid what they did. They're trying to find some pattern maybe, or they're listening to what went wrong so they make sure they don't go down that path. But we listen in order to find out how to stay safe. And that's why I want to focus on stories of sin in the Bible. Because as we study them, there are all these warning signs to us as Christians about the roads we do not need to go down, the paths we must avoid to stay spiritually safe. And you can probably guess the first story we're going to begin with. We're going to start at the very beginning in a lesson entitled Death's Throne, as we go back to Genesis chapter 3 in the Garden of Eden and read the story of how sin entered into the world and death through sin. In Genesis 1, God makes man in His own image, and He gives him this incredible freedom. The animal kingdom doesn't have this freedom. But He warned the first humans the dangerous potential that came along with that freedom. There's a law that He gives in Genesis chapter 2, verse 17. It says, "Of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die." Now, Francis Schaeffer in his book on Genesis says, Adam and Eve already knew good because God put them in a good world. So they already had the knowledge of good. And now here God is giving them the knowledge of evil, but it's just potential knowledge. He's giving them the knowledge of the possibility of evil. And He's warning them about experiential knowledge. He's saying, if you eat this fruit, you're going to go from potential knowledge to experiential knowledge, and it's the experiential knowledge that's going to be dangerous for you. Now here we see a stark contrast between God and man. God is infinite. And that means He knows everything. He knows the past, present, and the future. We sang this song, and it was poetic license. I don't have a problem with the song, but in the song I was thinking about this lesson and how we sing, "Remember, I'm human," to God. Well, He doesn't need a reminder of that. You know, He's God. He knows everything. He never forgets anything, right? That's what an infinite mind is. So He knows, He has knowledge of the actual, and He has knowledge of the possible. Now, we're finite. We can only know what we've experienced or what people have told us. And we don't know all the potential. We only know the actual or what people have told us. And so God's saying, listen, as your omniscient creator, I'm going to give you a warning. You have this incredible freedom to choose right from wrong. I'm warning you, choose right every time. You don't want to experience evil, because the experience of evil is death. Death will come as a result. And sadly, they didn't listen to Him. They didn't trust Him, or they trusted the serpent more than they trusted God. They ate of the fruit. They experienced evil. And that's why the world is the way that it is today. Looking back on that pivotal moment in the first true crime in history, Paul writes these words in Romans chapter 5, verse 12 through 14. By the way, we'll be going back and forth between the story in Genesis 3 and Paul's commentary on the story in Romans chapter 5. Here's what he says in the verses Riley read for us a moment ago. "Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men, because all sinned. For sin indeed was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not counted where there is no law. Death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sinning was not like the transgression of Adam, who was a type of the one who was to come. He says death began to reign in this moment in history. That's why we're calling the lesson Death's Throne. We're going to notice three things about death. First, we're going to see that death came. Secondly, we're going to see that death shamed. And thirdly, we're going to see that death reigned. Let's start with number one, death came. And it was never God's intention for death to enter into the world. There's an ongoing debate over whether Adam and Eve's bodies were created immortal. But at least we know this. He put them in a garden near the tree of life. And He said of that tree that if anyone ate the fruit of the tree of life, they would live forever. So you can debate over whether they were created this way or they had the possibility of living this way. At the end of Genesis chapter 3, He puts cherubim at the garden to guard the tree of life so that they could not enter into it, eat of the tree of life, and live forever. So they had the ability to live forever. There was no death into the world. Add to that Paul said in Romans 5:12 that death came into the world through sin. And up until the point they ate of the forbidden fruit, no sin had ever occurred on earth. And so if death enters through sin, and there was no sin, there was no death until the sin. That tells me it was never God's intention for death to be a part of His creation. Nothing's worse than death. Death casts a pall over the human experience. We'll have our moments of happiness and joy, but we're always reminded that we're mortals. Life is perishable. It's temporary. It's brief. Death comes suddenly and unexpectedly in many cases. And so we have these periodic moments of happiness, but they're tempered by the knowledge of our own mortality. A good God did not create a world like that. It's sin that made the world the way it is, that made death a reality for us. And God warned Adam and Eve that in the day they ate of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they would surely die. I remember as a kid really struggling with that because I was taught that in Bible class. On the day you eat of it, you will surely die. And so I don't remember the first time I heard the story, but I'm sure when I was able to understand it and register it, I was following along with a teacher. She gets to the point they eat it, and they don't die. So what happens? You know, what's going on there? And the day that you eat, you will surely die. Well, it's not the best translation. If you want the literal interpretation, what it is in Hebrew, it says something like, dying, you shall die. In other words, you will begin to die and you will end in death. There will be an end to your life. Robert Alter's translation probably has a good way of putting it where he says, you will be doomed to die. The day they ate it, in that moment, they were certainly headed towards death. Dying, you shall die. They began to die and they would die. That's the meaning there of the warning. What's death? Well, death is a separation. It's not just the end. We know that we live beyond the grave. Death is a separation. So physically speaking, it's a separation of the physical body from the spirit, the immaterial part of us that lives beyond the grave. So Solomon says in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 7, that the dust, meaning our bodies, the dust will return to the earth as it was. Our bodies will disintegrate into the primary elements that composed us in the first place, but the spirit unto God who gave it. So there's a separation, and we're reminded of that every funeral we go to. We see the body of our loved one, but we know they're not there. And what we commit to the ground is not our loved one. The spirit of that person went on and is in the hands of God. James said the spirit, the body apart from the spirit is dead. So separation. Physically, the body from the spirit. Spiritually speaking, of course, that means a separation of the soul, the person, from God. Isaiah 59, 1 and 2. Behold, the Lord's hand is not shortened that it cannot save, nor his ear dull that he cannot hear. But your iniquities have made a separation between you and your God, and your sins have hidden his face from you so that he does not hear. That's what sin does. It drives a wedge between you and God. It's a break in the relationship. And that's why we talk so much about the need for reconciliation. So knowing that death is a separation and it came into the world through sin, it wasn't God's original intention. Let's look at what happened. Turn back to Genesis chapter 3 and look at the fallout in verses 16 through 17. In Romans 5, Paul talks, I think it's in verse 16, about judgment and condemnation. And he uses some interesting language there as you turn over to Genesis 3. In Romans 5, he uses this word crima, which you can hear the relation to our theme, true crime. Crima is translated judgment, and katakrima is translated condemnation. And those words are kind of related to one another. They're very closely related to one another. And if you distinguish them, they would have to do with the verdict and the sentence. Okay, so when they sinned, they received the verdict and the sentence. Overall, we know that's death that came into the world, but let's break it down into the curses that are spelled out in verses 16 through 19 of Genesis chapter 3. First of all, he gives the judgment on Eve. And what he says in verse 16 to the woman is, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. Did she have pain before in childbearing? Well, this seems to suggest that she didn't, that the labor and the horrible pain that comes along with it was not a part of God's original idea. Sin brought that into the world. He says to her also that your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Maybe they were partners at the point of creation in ruling over the earth. But this was the point where God put the order in the family, that the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 and 23. But that is the change that happened for the woman. To the earth, he says that the ground will be cursed because of what Adam did. The world is not today the way God created it. It's under a curse. It's broken. Things fall apart. As Yates said, the sinner cannot hold. There's the second law of thermodynamics. Entropy takes over. When you leave the world alone, it goes toward chaos and disorder. That wasn't the way it was in the beginning. God's presence left this world in some sense so that it was no longer holding together the way it did at creation. And so things got harder for humanity and life on earth, which applies to what he says to Adam next in the last part of Genesis 3:17 and following. He says to him, in pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. So sorrow and pain enters into the world for humanity. There's a disease that we have to deal with, injuries. We have losses and heartaches. He continues to say, thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field, and by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread. Work was always a part of life. I believe that work, productive work, good work is going to be a part of heaven. But the work today is toilsome and hard. I took the day off Thursday to try to get some things done. And I won't get specifics because I'll get frustrated again. But there was one thing that I was just determined to get done, and then a lot of other things, and I was still on item number 1 on my list by the end of the day. And I never got it done. I'm still waiting to get it done. And that's what happens. You make plans, and the best laid plans of mice and men go awry. They fall apart. And that's the way work is today. It's frustrating, it's toilsome, even to get the simplest things done. You run into problems you don't anticipate. Farming is difficult. We have to deal with weeds. We have to deal with drought, bad weather conditions, too much water, not enough water. That's not the way the world was before sin entered in and death came. He ends by saying, out of it you were taken, out of the ground you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. There's this emphasis on the ground, on the earth. You see it again in Genesis 6. It's the same word. I think it's translated land or earth there. But over and over again, you see this emphasis on the ground, which is the same word from which Adam got his name. He came from this ground. The earth from which we came is cursed, and we're cursed too, because we who were meant to dwell forever with God now have to face this separation of body from soul, and possibly, at least in that moment, of the person from God. Death came. It wasn't God's original intention, but He gave us this choice that made love possible, and we chose poorly, and so we died. But secondly, notice that death shamed. The experience of evil immediately made Adam and Eve uncomfortable. You know this part of the story. Look at Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. What's going on there? Well, they felt shame. And it was good that they felt shame. Shame is a function of the conscience. The conscience, I believe, is something that makes us different from the animals. It's part of what it means to be made in the image of God. I don't think that's all that's entailed in being made in the image of God, but I think it's a big part of it. And the conscience is this feeling of obligation to do what's right. And when you violate the conscience, it gives you this feeling of guilt or shame when you do wrong. And all human beings are born with that. And it's a good thing. Mark Twain said, humans are the only animals that blush or need to blush. And that's right. We're the ones that give the choice, are given choices in morality between right or wrong. And the conscience is a very good tool to push us to do what's right and to lead us away from doing the wrong thing. And when we do the wrong thing, to encourage us to repent and make it right. Now, it's important to point out that sometimes the conscience can be misprogrammed. Paul is a great example. Paul did a lot of bad things without violating his conscience. I don't know if it's hyperbole or if he was speaking literally in Acts 23:1, but he said to someone in Acts 23:1, I've lived my life in all good conscience up to this day. Which means what I did wrong in the past in persecuting Christians, I did it thinking it was the right thing to do. My conscience was actually leading me to do it, and when I didn't do it, I felt guilty about not doing it. When he learned differently, his conscience started pushing him in the right direction. It needs to be programmed with the correct information. That's why you need to study your Bible and learn from Christian leaders and teachers. You don't need to just go out and do what feels right. Your conscience needs that programming. But it's an important tool, and if you're not careful, you can violate it to the point it's no good any longer. When we seek peace these days in two ways. Either by following the conscience or trying to destroy it. Because the conscience is usually what brings us turmoil inside. Right? So you either follow it and pacify it, or you destroy it. And I'll let you figure out what most people are trying to do these days. They're trying to destroy the conscience. They don't see the value of it. And they want to violate it to the point that it loses its sensitivity to sin. The Native Americans pictured the conscience as an arrowhead buried in the chest. And they told this story that when you violated your conscience, it would spin in your chest and it would cut. And that's the pain that you feel within. But if you do it too often, the points of the arrowhead would dull to the point that it could spin without you feeling it at all. This is the concept that Paul talks about in Ephesians 4:19 when he talks about people who have become callous. Another translation says past feeling. Or in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 2, when he talks about those whose consciences are seared as with a hot iron. It's like the skin on a cow's hide after it's been branded. You violate your conscience too many times, and you get to the point where it doesn't do you any good. And that's not a good thing for you. It may make it to where you can sin and not feel bad about it, where you can do wrong to others and get a lot of sleep at night, where you can hoard up your wealth and greed and not care about others, and it doesn't bother you at all. But at the end of time, death is going to come and get you. You're not going to have that shame anymore, but it's not good for you. It's not good for you at all. One woman told about a visit to a foreign land where she went to a museum, and one of the sights in the museum was this mounted two-headed calf. And the curator of the museum said that this monstrosity of an animal with this horrible birth defect only lived 2 days. Then he told the story. He said it could have lived a lot longer, but it was its own undoing, because these heads one was beautiful and looked the way a calf should look, and the other was deformed and mangled and ugly. And he said when they fed the milk to the beautiful head, the ugly head would spit it out so that the milk never got to the stomach. And he told the story, and of course it wasn't true. It couldn't be true. I don't think that's the way anatomy works in even two-headed calves, but it's the story of a symbol of what happens to our two selves when we're not cooperating with our conscience. The conscience is receiving these signals from God, God's Word, telling us what to do with it, trying to nourish the soul, and we're spitting it out. And it's our own undoing when we do that. We need that shame. We need that conscience. It didn't come on us until sin entered into the world, and death by sin, when the man and the woman realized first that they were naked. Let's go in the third place. After all this transpired, death reigned. It replaced life as the king of mankind. The first man and woman were driven out of the garden, and cherubim were placed east of Eden to guard the gate to the tree of life so that they couldn't enter back in, eat of the tree, and live forever. Paul describes it in Romans 5:14 and 17 as taking earth as its throne and reigning over mankind. In the book of Hebrews, we're told that through fear of death, we're subject to lifelong slavery. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 15. And from that point forward, an awful cycle began in humanity that is yet to be unbroken by any of us. And Paul describes it once again in Romans 5:12, that sin entered into the world and death through sin. Each and every one of us have sinned, have become separated from God, and are headed towards physical death. It's true of all of us, and it's a humbling, sobering thought, but it's true, and we need to understand the results of that death entering into the world at that point. There's no exceptions. In Ingmar Bergman's movie, The Seventh Seal, this disillusioned knight encounters death. "Who are you?" he asks. Death says, "I'm death." The knight says, "Have you come for me?" And death says, "I've long walked by your side, so I've noticed," said the knight. "Are you ready?" The knight says, "My body is ready, but I'm not." Death approaches the knight, and then the knight says, "Wait a moment." And death says, "You all say that, but I grant no reprieves." There are no exceptions. George Bernard Shaw said, "The statistics on death are impressive. 1 out of every 1 persons die." And that's true. I mean, that's the best statistic I've ever heard. We need to understand that death reigns in the sense there are no exceptions. But that's not the end of the story. I purposely left out a couple of details, strange details from Genesis 3, that I wanted to save till this moment because the story's not over. One is about the shame and those fig leaf loincloths. Okay, this is a strange detail to be in the story in the first place. But near the end, in chapter 3, verse 21, we read that God made clothing for them out of animal hides and clothed them. Now, I've heard that used in sermons on modesty, that a fig leaf is not enough covering for your body. And that's true. I agree with that wholeheartedly, but I don't think that's the main point Moses was trying to get across here. There's something more going on there, don't you think? What had to happen in order for God to cover them with animal hides? I mean, He could have made the whole suit out of fig leaves, but He chose animal hides because some animals had to die. I don't know if He had Adam and Eve sacrifice animals. We see in the next scene, in the next story of sin we'll talk about, their sons making sacrifices, one of which was an animal sacrifice. Maybe God Himself killed the animals, but there was more death, and this time it was animals. And that's an interesting detail. There seems to be some foreshadowing there. The other detail is what the Lord said to the serpent, which I purposely skipped over a moment ago, recorded in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. You remember what He says? I will put enmity, He says to the serpent, between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you, the serpent, shall bruise his heel. He says to the serpent, you're going to deal him a blow to the heel, which is not fatal, but the son, the offspring of this woman, will deal a mortal blow to your head. He will put an end to you, to Satan, once and for all. Those are some very important details. And the world didn't know what to make of them until a man from Nazareth came and fulfilled them. First of all, He lives well into adulthood without sinning. And so He breaks this cycle we're all in, this cycle of sin and death. He breaks it. He was tempted in every respect as we are, yet without sin. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15. But then the second thing is, He's crucified between thieves as a criminal, even though He didn't sin. Just as those animals that were killed so that God can make clothing for Adam and Eve, they didn't sin, they didn't do anything wrong, they didn't have anything to do with the eating of the forbidden fruit. Just as they didn't do anything wrong and they were killed because of what Adam and Eve did, Jesus died on the cross, not because of anything that He did, but because of what we did. And during the process, they strip Him naked. No less than 4 times. You can read through it and count it. They strip Him before they scourge Him. They strip Him again to mock Him by putting a robe on Him. They strip Him again to crucify Him. No less than 4 times. They humiliate Him and shame Him as much as they could. And remember, we're the ones that should carry the shame. But the shame was put on Him. And then He broke the cycle another way as well. Death came, but death wasn't the end of His story. He showed that death would not reign over Him because 3 days after His death, He rose from the tomb where He was laid. In Romans chapter 5, before Paul gets into the reign of death and this first story of sin, he says this beginning in verse 6. Romans chapter 5, verse 6. While we were still weak, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. One will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows His love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since therefore we have now been justified by His blood, much more shall we be saved by Him from the wrath of God. For if while we were enemies we were reconciled to God by the death of His Son, much more, now that we are reconciled, shall we be saved by His life. Friends, we're all trapped in this cycle that began with the very first sin. A cycle of sin and death, a cycle we were unable to break, but it was broken by the only innocent man who ever lived. He never sinned, and He died for us. and He rose from the dead, and He's the first fruits of those who've fallen asleep, and all those who believe in Him and obey His word and follow Him will live as He lived. We look at this story, we see how all the sin and all the crime began, and we end thanking God that we have hope. Do you have that hope? Is it yours? Are you ready to meet God? Has the cycle been broken for you? He wants it to be. Let us help you this morning. If you need to break that cycle, if you need Jesus to come and break the cycle for you, we can help you this morning, right now, as we stand together and as we sing.